The drill sergeant's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. "Martinez, you're built like a scarecrow in a hurricane. The army doesn't need walking coat hangers." Private Danny Martinez stood at attention, his uniform hanging loose on his 135-pound frame, sweat already beading on his forehead despite the cool October morning. Around him, the other recruits tried not to smirk. This was Fort Benning, 1943, where weakness was currency nobody wanted to spend. And by every measure that mattered to the United States Army, Danny Martinez was bankrupt. At 19 years old, Danny looked more like he belonged behind a grocery counter than on a battlefield. 5 feet 6 inches tall, thin wrists that made his rifle look oversized, and a quiet voice that barely carried past the front rank during drill. His drill instructor, Sergeant Murphy, had made it clear from day one. Some of you boys are going to be heroes, some of you are going to be casualties, and some of you, he'd pause, looking directly at Danny, are going to be problems for the men who actually know how to fight. The other recruits had nicknames. Big Mike from Chicago, who could bench press 200 pounds. Texas Tom, who'd been hunting since he was 12 and could hit a dime at 50 yards. Fast Eddie from Brooklyn, who moved like water and talked twice as quick. Danny's nickname was simpler. They called him Stick. Not because he was tough or reliable, but because he looked like he'd snap in half if you breathed on him wrong. But what nobody knew, what couldn't be measured in push-ups or rifle scores or how loud you could yell, "Yes, sir," was what Danny carried inside. His father had died building the Hoover Dam when Danny was 14. A steel beam had shifted during construction, crushing 3 men instantly. Danny had watched his mother work 16-hour days at the textile mill to keep food on the table. He'd seen what real strength looked like, and it had nothing to do with how much weight you could lift. The army had different ideas about strength. Physical fitness tests, marksmanship scores, combat drills that separated the wheat from the chaff. Danny failed most of them. His push-up count was barely passing. His mile run times were consistently in the bottom 10%. During bayonet training, bigger recruits would knock him down so easily it looked choreographed. The instructors would shake their heads and make notes on their clipboards. "Martinez, you're sure you didn't lie about your age?" Sergeant Murphy asked one afternoon after Danny had struggled through another obstacle course. "Maybe you're actually 12 and just tall for your age." The other recruits laughed. Danny said nothing, just wiped mud from his face and got back in line. But there were signs, small ones, that something different lived inside the quiet kid from Nevada. During night marches, when bigger men were dropping from exhaustion, Danny kept walking. His pace never changed. Step after step, mile after mile, like a machine that ran on determination instead of fuel. When other recruits complained about the food, the heat, the endless repetition of military life, Danny absorbed it all without comment. Private Johnson, who bunked next to Danny, noticed it first. "You ever get tired, Stick?" he asked one night after a particularly brutal training day. Danny was cleaning his rifle by candlelight, the same meticulous routine he performed every evening. "Sure," Danny replied without looking up. "But tired don't mean quit." Johnson had grown up in Detroit, where being tough meant talking tough. This was something different. This was quiet steel. The real test came in week 8 of basic training. Combat simulation exercises designed to weed out anyone who couldn't handle the psychological pressure of battle. Live ammunition fired overhead while recruits crawled through mud and barbed wire. Explosions detonating close enough to feel the concussion. Drill instructors screaming contradictory orders to create confusion and panic. Big Mike froze halfway through the course. The sound of machine gun fire overhead triggered something primal, and he pressed himself into the mud, refusing to move forward. Texas, Tom made it further but panicked when an explosion went off too close, abandoning his weapon and running backward towards the starting line. Even fast Eddie, who'd bragged about street fights in Brooklyn, lost his nerve when shrapnel from a controlled detonation peppered the ground around him. Danny crawled forward, methodically, carefully, never stopping. When explosions shook the earth, he kept moving. When bullets cracked overhead, he maintained his pace. Other recruits were screaming, crying, or frozen with terror. Danny's breathing never changed. Steady inhale, steady exhale, steady progress through the nightmare they'd constructed to break him. Sergeant Murphy watched through binoculars from the observation tower. He'd seen thousands of recruits go through this course. Some were natural warriors who charged through like they were invincible. Others were average soldiers who pushed through on guts and training. And some, like Danny Martinez, moved with a different kind of courage entirely. They weren't fearless. They were afraid and kept going anyway. "What do you make of that one?" Captain Stevens asked, pointing at Danny's slow but relentless progress through the course. Murphy lowered his binoculars and considered his answer. "Sir, I've been breaking recruits for 15 years. That boy there, he don't break. Don't know what he's made of, but it ain't the same stuff as the others." When Danny finally completed the course, mud-covered and exhausted but upright, something had changed. Not in him, but in how others saw him. The same physical limitations remained. He still couldn't do more push-ups or run faster miles or outshoot the farm boys who'd grown up with rifles. But there was recognition now, grudging respect from men who'd watched him refuse to quit when quitting would have been easier. The graduation ceremony was held on a cold December morning. Families gathered to watch their sons become soldiers, proud faces in the crowd as names were called and assignments read. Danny's mother had taken the bus from Nevada, her hands worn from factory work but her eyes bright with pride. She'd never doubted her son, even when everyone else had. "Private Martinez, Daniel J." The voice echoed across the parade ground. "Assignment, 36th Infantry Division, Italy." Danny stepped forward to receive his orders, the same thin kid who'd arrived 3 months earlier. The uniform fit better now, not because he'd gained much weight, but because he'd learned to carry himself differently, like a soldier. In the crowd, his mother wiped away tears. She remembered the 14-year-old boy who'd promised to take care of her after his father died, who'd worked after-school jobs and never complained about responsibilities that should have belonged to else, who'd enlisted not because he wanted to be a hero, but because it was his turn to serve. The other recruits received their assignments with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Some were heading to the Pacific Theatre, others to England to prepare for the invasion of Europe. Danny was bound for Italy, where American forces were fighting their way up the peninsula against determined German resistance. The newspapers called it a secondary front, but the casualty reports told a different story. As the ceremony concluded and families began their farewells, Sergeant Murphy pulled Danny aside. "Martinez, you listen to me. I've seen a lot of boys go off to war. Some of them were twice your size and half as tough. You remember that when things get bad over there, and they will get bad." Danny nodded, understanding that this was the closest thing to encouragement he'd ever received from his drill instructor. That night, Danny sat in the barracks writing a letter to his mother. Around him, other soldiers packed their gear and made last-minute preparations for deployment. Tomorrow they would board trains bound for ports on the East Coast, then ships bound for a war that would test everything they'd learned about themselves and each other. The letter to his mother was simple, the way Danny always wrote. No flowery language or grand proclamations, just facts delivered with the same quiet certainty that had carried him through basic training. "Dear Mama, we ship out tomorrow for Italy. The food is better than home and the men are good. Don't worry about me. I'll write when I can. Your son, Danny." He folded the paper carefully and tucked it into an envelope, knowing it might be weeks before she received it. The train ride to the port took 18 hours through countryside that grew progressively colder as they headed east. Danny sat by the window, watching America roll past in the grey light of early winter. Farmland stretched to the horizon, broken by small towns where people gathered at railroad crossings to wave at the troop trains. Children held flags, women dabbed their eyes with handkerchiefs, and old men stood at attention with their hats over their hearts. Private Williams, a stocky kid from Alabama, dealt cards on the seat between them. "You play poker, Stick?" Danny shook his head. He'd never had money to gamble with, and the habit of saving every penny died hard. "Smart man," Williams said, shuffling the deck. "Most of these boys are going to lose their pay before we even see combat." The conversation turned, as it always did, to what waited for them across the Atlantic. Italy was a mystery to most of the soldiers. They knew American forces had landed at Salerno in September, that the Germans were fighting for every hill and valley, that progress was measured in yards rather than miles. The newspapers back home painted it as steady advancement toward victory. But the replacement requests told a different story. "My cousin shipped out with the 3rd Infantry Division last year," said Thompson, a farm boy from Iowa. "I haven't heard from him since October. His last letter mentioned something called Monte Cassino." The name meant nothing to them then, just another Italian town they'd probably never heard of again. None of them could have imagined that within months that name would be carved into American military history with blood and sacrifice. The ship that carried them across the Atlantic was a converted luxury liner, its elegant dining rooms and ballrooms now packed with triple-stacked bunks and soldiers' gear. The crossing took 12 days through winter storms that left half the men seasick and miserable. Danny, who'd never seen an ocean before enlisting, found his sea legs quickly. While others hung over the rail feeding the fish, he maintained the same steady routine that had carried him through training. Each morning began with calisthenics on deck, the same exercises that had nearly broken him at Fort Benning. He still couldn't do as many push-ups as the bigger men, still finished his runs in the middle of the pack, but something fundamental had changed. The other soldiers no longer saw weakness when they looked at him. They saw reliability, the kind of steady presence that made good units function. The Italian coast appeared on a cold February morning, mountains rising from the sea like ancient fortresses. The port city of Naples bore the scars of war, bombed buildings and rubble-filled streets that spoke of recent battles. As their transport ship eased toward the dock, Danny could hear the distant thunder of artillery, a constant rumble that never quite stopped. The 36th Infantry Division had been fighting in Italy since September, suffering heavy casualties in the mountains south of Rome. Fresh replacements were desperately needed, and the new arrivals were processed quickly through a system designed for efficiency rather than comfort. Medical checks, equipment issue, assignment to units that had been ground down by months of combat. Danny found himself assigned to Baker Company, 2nd Battalion, along with a dozen other replacements. The company commander, Captain Rodriguez, was a veteran of the North African campaign with tired eyes and premature grey in his hair. He addressed the new men in a tent that served as company headquarters, maps covering every available surface. "Gentlemen, welcome to Italy. You're here because this company has taken 70% casualties since we landed. The men you're replacing were good soldiers who died doing their jobs. Your job is to stay alive long enough to do yours." His voice carried the flat tone of a man who delivered this speech too many times. "The Germans have had months to dig in. Every hill is a fortress, every valley a killing ground. They know this terrain better than we do, and they're not giving up ground without making us pay for it." The veterans who remained in Baker Company studied the replacements with the calculating eyes of men who'd learned not to get too attached to new faces. Sergeant Kowalski, a Polish immigrant from Chicago who'd been with the unit since Tunisia, pulled Danny aside after the briefing. "You ever been shot at, kid?" Danny shook his head. "Well, you're about to learn." The Krauts up in those hills, they're not the same army we fought in Africa. These are mountain troops, specialists who know how to use terrain like a weapon. Danny's first night in Italy was spent in a dugout carved into the side of a hill, sharing space with 3 other soldiers. The sound of artillery never stopped, sometimes close enough to shake dirt from the ceiling, sometimes distant enough to blend into the background noise of war. Machine gun fire chattered sporadically across no man's land, and occasionally the crack of sniper rifles reminded everyone that death could come from anywhere. Private Castellano, a veteran of 4 months who qualified as an old-timer in this war of attrition, explained the routine. "We hold this line during the day, run patrols at night and wait for orders to attack the next hill. The Germans do the same thing from their side. It's like a deadly game of King of the Mountain, except the mountain keeps changing hands and the price keeps going up." The replacements were integrated into existing squads paired with veterans who could show them how to stay alive. Danny found himself assigned to Sergeant Patterson, a lean Texan who'd earned his stripes the hard way. Patterson had a reputation for bringing his men back alive, which made him popular with replacements and respected by officers who needed results. "Martinez, right?" Patterson looked Danny up and down, taking in the thin frame and quiet manner. "You don't look like much, but then again, neither did the last 3 replacements they sent me. 2 of them are in the aid station and one's in a grave outside Anzio. You planning on being different?" Danny met his eyes steadily. "Yes, Sergeant. I plan on doing my job." Patterson nodded slowly. "We'll see." "First rule of staying alive up here is simple. Listen to orders, keep your head down, and don't try to be a hero. Heroes get themselves killed, and worse, they get their squad mates killed too." The first patrol came 3 days later, a night reconnaissance mission to determine German strength on the next hill in their path of advance. 8 men moving through darkness across terrain that favored the defenders, trying to gather intelligence without starting a firefight that would alert every German position for miles around. Danny moved through the Italian darkness like a shadow, his thin frame finally an advantage rather than a liability. While bigger men struggled to navigate silently through the rocky terrain, Danny flowed between boulders and brush without disturbing so much as a pebble. Sergeant Patterson had positioned him as the squad's point man, a role typically reserved for the most experienced soldiers. The German positions lay 800 yards ahead, carved into the hillside with the precision that had made the Wehrmacht famous. Intelligence reports suggested a reinforced company, but reports had been wrong before. Too many American attacks had walked into carefully prepared killing zones because someone had underestimated enemy strength. Through his binoculars, Danny studied the enemy lines. No movement, no sound except the wind through pine trees and the distant rumble of artillery from other sectors. But something felt wrong. The positions looked too quiet, too perfect. In his brief time at the front, Danny had developed an instinct for danger, the kind of sixth sense that kept soldiers alive when training and equipment weren't enough. He signaled Patterson, who crawled forward to join him behind a fallen log. "What do you see, Martinez?" the sergeant whispered. Danny pointed toward the German trenches. "Sergeant, it's too clean. No cigarette glow, no movement, no sound. Either they're the most disciplined troops in the German army, or there's nobody home." Patterson studied the hillside through his own binoculars, considering Danny's assessment. Could be a trap. Germans love their ambushes. Patterson made the decision quickly. "We go closer. You and Jenkins swing left. Castellano and I take the center approach. If this is a trap, we'll trigger it on our terms." The squad split into 2-man teams, advancing through terrain that offered concealment but little cover if things went wrong. Danny and Jenkins, a nervous replacement from Ohio, worked their way up the hillside using techniques Danny had absorbed through observation rather than formal training. Every step was calculated, every pause deliberate. Jenkins breathed too hard, moved too quickly, made the small mistakes that got men killed in country where the enemy had all the advantages. 50 yards from the German positions, Danny held up his hand. Jenkins froze, sweat beading on his face despite the cold mountain air. Through the darkness, Danny could see into the enemy trenches now. Empty. Not recently abandoned, but deliberately vacated. The Germans had pulled back to better positions, leaving this hill as bait for an American attack that would stumble into a carefully prepared crossfire. The patrol returned with intelligence that saved Baker Company from walking into a massacre. The planned assault was cancelled, reconnaissance flights revealed the true German positions, and artillery was redirected to more productive targets. Captain Rodriguez commended the squad for professional work, but it was Sergeant Patterson who pulled Danny aside afterward. "Martinez, how did you know?" Patterson lit a cigarette, cupping the flame carefully to avoid sniper attention. Danny considered the question, trying to explain instincts he didn't fully understand himself. "Back home, I hunted rabbits in the desert. You learn to read sign, to notice when something's not right. Same principle, different terrain." Word of Danny's reconnaissance skills spread through the battalion with the speed that good news travelled in units starved for advantages. Within a week, he was being requested for patrols by squad leaders who'd heard about the quiet replacement who could read enemy positions like a book. His small size, which had been a liability in training, became an asset in the mountains where stealth mattered more than brute strength. The breakthrough came during the third week of March. Allied intelligence had identified Hill 394 as a key German observation post, perfectly positioned to direct artillery fire on American supply routes. The hill had to be taken, but previous attacks had failed with heavy casualties. The German defenders, elements of the 1st Mountain Division, were among the Wehrmacht's elite troops. Baker Company drew the assignment as part of a larger divisional assault. The plan was simple in concept, brutal in execution. 3 companies would attack simultaneously from different directions, overwhelming the defenders through coordinated pressure. Danny's squad was assigned to the northern approach, the most difficult route, but also the one most likely to achieve surprise. The night before the attack, Danny wrote another letter to his mother. The words came slowly, each sentence carefully chosen to convey reassurance without revealing the dangers ahead. "Dear Mama, the weather is getting warmer and the food is improving. The Italian countryside is beautiful, full of olive groves and stone churches that remind me of pictures in your Bible. I'm learning a lot and making friends with good men. Your son, Danny." Captain Rodriguez addressed the company before dawn, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "Gentlemen, this is what we came here to do. The Germans on that hill have been killing Americans for 3 months. Today we settle accounts. Follow your squad leaders, trust your training, and watch out for each other." Questions? There were none. The time for questions had passed. The assault began at first light with an artillery barrage that shook the mountain like an earthquake. For 20 minutes, American guns poured shells into the German positions, smoke and debris fountaining skyward with each impact. Then silence, sudden and complete, broken only by the whistle that signaled the infantry attack. Danny's squad advanced through terrain that seemed designed to break attacking forces. Loose shale that shifted under every step, gullies that channeled men into killing zones, boulders that provided concealment for defenders and exposure for attackers. The northern approach was supposedly the easiest route, but easy was a relative term when measured against cliffs and machine gun nests. The first German position appeared suddenly. A camouflaged bunker built into the hillside with interlocking fields of fire. Patterson signaled the squad to ground as machine gun tracers began probing their advance. The bunker had survived the artillery barrage, its thick log and stone construction proof against everything except direct hits. "Martinez, can you get close enough for grenades?" Patterson shouted over the machine gun fire. Danny studied the approaches, calculating angles and distances with the same methodical precision he'd brought to every challenge since basic training. There was a route, dangerous but possible, using a dry stream bed that ran within 30 yards of the bunker. Danny began his approach alone, leaving his rifle behind to move faster and quieter. The stream bed provided concealment, but not cover, meaning detection would be fatal. He moved in short rushes, timing each advance to coincide with bursts of machine gun fire that would mask any sound he might make. Danny Martinez returned home to Nevada, a decorated soldier, carrying medals that meant less to him than the knowledge that he'd proven something important. Not to the drill sergeants who'd mocked him, not to the recruits who'd called him stick, but to himself. Real strength wasn't about how much weight you could lift or how loud you could yell. It was about taking another step when your body screamed to quit, about doing your job when everything inside you wanted to run. The skinny kid from Nevada had learned what his father knew building the Hoover Dam, what his mother knew working 16-hour shifts at the mill. Sometimes the strongest steel is forged in the quietest furnaces, and sometimes the most unlikely heroes are the ones who simply refuse to break.